we're gonna move on to the next talk by Ffion, Naylor, Vinicius, Macuch. I hope I'm telling your names correctly. From the University of Osnabrück, and Anna Rohde from University of Edinburgh. And they're going to talk about the non-actual, actual expectation of for upcoming figurative language arise from cues about message truth.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Right, so this is joint work with Ffion Roberts and Hannah Rohde, both at Edinburgh, and we'll be talking to you about non-actual, actual, an experimental investigation on expectations about upcoming figurative language and how those might arise from cues about message truth. Okay, so just to sort of briefly go over what I'm going to show you, so just to try to situate this within the discussions of this meeting, then I'll talk about a study in which we norm the items that we use in our main processing experiment, our reading experiment. I'll move on to the reading experiment, and I'll try to bring everything together. Okay, so if we think of what language users might be trying to do when they want to communicate a certain message and how they might then produce their linguistic signal, we see that depending on the devices available to them in their languages, so they might, for example, mix up different sorts of lexical devices such as adjectives, adverbs, but also all sorts of specialized particles, as well as grammatical devices of different sorts, including, for example, modality or evidentiality. If we reverse this equation and try to think of what interpreters might be trying to do when they're trying to infer meaning from linguistic signals, so we know that they will be relying on these different sorts of lexical cues. They will be also relying on the different sorts of grammatical cues. But importantly, they might also be reasoning pragmatically about what it is that their interlocutor is trying to tell them. And in today's talk, we'll be focusing at this interface here. So we're talking about pragmatic reasoning about sentence internal lexical cues. Okay. So more specifically, we'll be talking about stance markers, and even more specifically about stance adjectives and how these might work as cues to interpretation. So let's think of the following utterance. So he's a real cheat sometimes during games. What we have here is in white a stance marking adjective modifying the head, the noun cheat. And what this adjective might be said to be doing is that it's intensifying the meaning of the noun, or it's intensifying the meaning of the sentence. Or in other words, it's basically marking the stance of the producer in relation to the propositional meaning of this sentence. Of course, we're talking about here a literal meaning, right? So cheat is a cheater, a cheat. Now let's compare this to a situation, very similar situation where we have, he's a real weasel sometimes during games, where weasel here is a non-literal meaning, right? So in the case of a metaphoric meaning where weasel might mean something like devious, right? Someone who's particularly devious. We still have here our adjective, right? Adding this meaning of intensification or reinforcement. But crucially for our purposes today, this clashes with the core semantic meaning of the word real, right? Which is something related to truthfulness or reality. So what we're going to be investigating here is how is it that interpreters might read and interpret these adjectives incrementally during the interpretation of metaphors. So to start with, we have our stance marking condition, which is the one that I just showed to you. So where we have he is a real weasel sometimes during games, right? So again, the stance marking adjective and the noun. Crucially, we'll be comparing those to situations where we have, for instance, he's a furry weasel sometimes during game, where what we have here is what we like to call a literal supporting cue, right? So furry weasel, most likely indicating that this is a literal meaning as opposed to a metaphoric meaning, right? And importantly, we are interested in looking at what happens at the sometimes region, or what happens at this strong probabilistic cue here, which is the adverbial, which very strongly signals that, well, whatever meaning it is that you're interpreting here, it should be a metaphoric meaning, right? Or at least it's more congruent with a metaphoric interpretation than with a literal one. And as you can probably see at this point, this is inconsistent with what you have found before, right? In the case of the literal supporting. And then to close up our design, we'll comparing those also to sentences of the sort, he's a devious weasel sometimes during games, where what we have here is a metaphor supporting condition, right? Where the adjective devious seem to suggest that this meaning is metaphor, it's metaphoric, right? Such that if you get then the composition of all those things together, very strongly you should be expecting to find a metaphor. And just to explain to you, so we're looking not only at real as a token of a stance adjective, but also literal and actual, right? So 3 different stance adjectives in English. Okay. So our specific goals for today are, in the first place, to ask the question, try to answer the question as to whether stance marking adjectives serve as pragmatic cues to interpretation in the online processing of non-literal language, right? More specifically, metaphoric language. Our second goal here today is to ask the question as to whether the conventionalized meaning of different markers, right, different adjectives, might affect their strength as pragmatic cues. And lastly, just to touch upon this very, very briefly, we'll also talk about whether cue strength might vary depending on the degree of conventionalization of the metaphors which are processed, right? Okay. So quickly about the norming study. What we were interested in doing here is understanding to what extent the metaphors that we were using in our reading experiment were conventionalized, right? So that means that the meaning of the X is Y, he is a weasel, actually leads to metaphoric meaning. So again, this is the design of our experiment. And what we did then is that we basically took our items, we presented them to different sample of participants, and we removed the PP that comes after the metaphor, right? But also the stance markers and all of the modifiers, right? So we presented people with these sentences, right? So he's a weasel, and we tried to gauge the extent to which they thought that this matched a particular metaphoric characteristic, right? So something like devious. In actually all cases, these were the same words that were used in the metaphor supporting scenario. So we were interested in doing is understanding to what extent they think that he's a weasel indicates that a person who is being talked about is devious or is not so devious. Okay, so this was a crowdsource experiment. I can talk about this if you'd like later. But here's the procedure. So this is what participants had to do. They were presented with, they overheard the following statement, right? So for example, she's a bat. And then they were asked to rate the extent to which they thought that the person who was being talked about, right? So that means that we highlighted the fact that this was metaphoric. We told them this is referring to a person and not to an animal. And to what extent they thought that this then matched this particular characteristic, right? So do you think that the producer of the sentence was trying to refer to this person as someone who's blind? And basically what they could do is then move this slider rating to the left or to the right to indicate to what extent they thought that was the case, such as so, right? So this means that, well, very much I think that this person is being referred to as blind. Okay, so here are the norms that we took from this norming study. And what I'm showing you here is, again, the extent to which the metaphors conform to the specific metaphoric characteristic. And here's an example from he's a wolf. So what you see here, and the characteristic is lonely. So what you see here is that basically what's purple here is where you have more data mass lying on the not so matching the characteristic, right? And the more green you get, that means the more data mass lying on the, well, that seems to match very much the characteristic, right? And here are the norms for the items then in the experiment. And this is just for now, so you can see that there's variation in the items, right? Okay. So let's go to our main experiment. This was a word-by-word self-paced reading. Fortunately, it was already introduced. This is the design of the experiment, right? So we're basically comparing metaphor supporting conditions to stance marking conditions to literal supporting conditions. And importantly, we're really interested in the adverbial sentence region, right? Sometimes. And that's because that's where you get this strong, again, probabilistic cue that is congruent with the metaphoric reading and incongruent with the literal supporting reading, right? Okay. So what I'm showing you here is the hypotheses which we have about the study. And these are qualitative, but what should be clear is that, let's go back here. So in the literal supporting scenario, you should be surprised by the sometimes, right? Because this is not in line with the composition that you've been developing so far, with the meaning that you've been trying to infer so far. Whereas in the metaphor supporting scenario, the processing of sometimes should be facilitated because that's very much in line with what you have read so far. So what that means is that we expect such a qualitative distinction here, right? Such that metaphor supporting items should be read more easily, and literal supporting items should be read more slowly. And of course, the real question then is what happens to our stance markers? If we assume that they are going to behave semantically, right, such that people are going to take the meaning of those markers at face value, then they should pattern more like the literal supporting ones. And this is to say that we don't have fine-grained quantitative predictions, we only have qualitative predictions. So this is to say that there should be more of a push towards literal supporting, right? But it doesn't have to be exactly like that. If, on the other hand, we assume that people are going to take these cues as pragmatic cues to meaning, right? Then we should expect them to pattern more like the metaphor supporting ones, right? And just as before, this is more of a push, not so much of this should be exactly the same, right? Okay. So this was a crowdsource experiment run online. And this is what participants had to do, right? So they were reading these sentences in this type. He is an actual lamb sometimes, and this is a critical region, right? So we measure reading times across the experiment, but this is where we're focusing at, and then also the 2 spillovers, right? Okay, so some words about data cleaning. The way that we analyze this data is that we fitted Bayesian hierarchical regression models, regressing the log transform reading times, so a transformation of the raw reading times, as a function of our conditions, right? So our adjectives, which had 3 levels: metaphor supporting, stance marking, and non-metaphoric. Then we had a group level structure, and we basically fitted these different models to the reading times coming from the critical regions. In order to answer question 2, the question about variation in terms of the markers, we had the very same items, but now instead of having a variable which had 3 levels, we have a variable which has 5 levels, right? So metaphor supporting, non-metaphoric, and then the 3 different levels of the adjectives. Okay, results. So what I'm plotting here, what I'm showing you is all of the sentence regions, right? So the entire sentence on the y-axis, and on the, sorry, the x-axis. On the y-axis, the raw untransformed reading times, right? Green is metaphor supporting, purple is literal supporting, and orange is stance marking. And this is what we get for the entire sentence region, for the entire sentence, right? But again, we'll be focusing right here. So I'm just showing you a close-up of the last sentence regions, just so we can see what's happening here at a region of interest sometimes. So what we see in the descriptive results is that indeed literal supporting is read more slowly than metaphor supporting, right? This comparison right here. And that seems to be the case as well for literal supporting being read more slowly than metaphor, than stance marking, right? So stance marking patterning like the metaphor support. And indeed, we find strong quantitative evidence in our models to support these descriptive results, such that these 2 comparisons here, there seems to be a true difference between means here, right? Okay. So now what I'm showing you is the very same data. Haven't done anything aside from just changing this one category called stance marking. I've just split it into basically the 3 different adjectives, right? So now we have actual, literal, and real separately. And let's look at the close-up right here. So what we can see right away is, so the green and the purple do not change. These are the same things. But what we see is that there is variation between those, right? So they seem to behave somewhat differently, such that, for example, literal here, the diamond seems to pattern more closely with metaphor supporting. And for example, real seems to pattern somewhat more closely to literal supporting. When we look at our models, what we see is that we only have strong quantitative evidence for a true difference between means in the case of literal supporting being read more slowly than literal, right? So that means that literal is patterning much like metaphor supporting, and the 2 other adjectives seem to be somewhat in between, right? So you can look at the probabilities, you can see they're quite high, but there's no strong evidence here. Okay. And this is just to show you that there's uncertainty in regards to these estimates. Okay. Now let's, if I have still some time left, let's come back to the metaphor conventionalization norms. These are the norms that I had before. And let's just try to make some sense of what's going on here. So for the first item here, so these are obviously gradient norms, right? That's the idea behind these norms. But if we try to categorize them, really try to split them categorically, what we find is that, so there is one item in which there's a bias against a metaphoric reading, right? So much of the data mass is on this side here, on this end. There's 3 items in which there's no particular bias. There seem to be sort of in between. She's a cow, she's a bat, she's a hen, right? And then here are the adjectives. And then importantly, most of our items, we do find, right? This is unmodified without any adjective. There is already a bias for these things being interpreted, at least in those terms here, right? Okay. So what I have here is just an exploratory analysis. I actually got this data not that long ago. So just to sort of try to understand what might be going on here. And what I'm plotting is the reading times from the sometimes region, right? The same things that we've been looking at. You still have here the aggregate means. But what I'm showing you then is all of the items plotted individually. And this is just so we can see roughly where each one of these animals lie, right? So we can have an understanding of where this variation might be coming from, right? Just to go back and try to clean this up and just try to see what we find in terms of patterns here, remember that the main findings that we had was that literal supporting, right, was being read more slowly than both metaphor supporting and stance marking, right, when put together. So if I basically just keep the items, right, I basically say, okay, I'm just filtering the items which match those 2 conditions. These are the items that I find, right? So this is 9 out of 15, which is a good sign, right? So most of our items are behaving that way. But I just wanted to sort of try and map them onto the norms, right, which are independent norms. And I just wanted to show you that most of these items which are here tend to be the ones that were actually rated as metaphorically for our baseline, right? There's also the non-metaphoric one, but yeah. So if we now look at situations in which there is no difference between stance marking and literal marking, right? Or stance marking is read even more slowly, we get these 4 items here: hen, bee, owl, and dog. And again, if I try to map this onto the norms, we see that these are basically, aside from bee, these are basically the items in which there is no bias, right? Dog is missing from here, but we have it from a different set of norms, and it's also categorized as no bias. Okay, let me try to bring all of this together. So our goals here today was, first of all, to try and answer the question as to whether stance marking adjectives serve as pragmatic cues to interpretation in the online processing of the literal language. And I would like to say that, yes, we have shown data and analysis that seem to support that, right? So this is what we found. Modal stance adjectives, when taken together, right, as a unified category, seem to behave much like metaphor supporting and unlike literal supporting adjectives, right? Okay. As for our second goal, and that is, does the conventionalized meaning of different adjectives, right, affect their strength as pragmatic cues? Well, here I'm not so sure. So if we look at our data here, the descriptive data, and also the evidence that we find in our models, there is variation, right? But it's kind of hard to say at this point what exactly is going on. So we see that for literal supports, so literal behaves like metaphor supporting, and importantly, it behaves unlike literal supporting, right? But for actual and real, they seem to be somewhere in between, right? So this is, I don't really know what to make of this yet, but yeah, I would like to hear from you. And then as for our last goal, which was very tentative, right? So does cue strength vary depending on the degree of conventionalization of the metaphors which are being processed, right? This is also an open question, but this is just to show you that, right, we should probably take this into account, right? So we have thought of ways of analyzing this already, where we should take this natural variation, which is probably goes beyond just being different items, right? But it has to do with the metaphors themselves. We should take that variation into account into our models and analyses. Okay. Future directions. What we are planning on doing, our next steps, is to integrate the conventionalization norms into our models, right? So basically have an interaction of the sort where we have not only main effective adjective, well, we have an interaction between the conditions and the norms, right? Another step would be then to look at, we've only been looking at adjectives here today, right? So we could look at other lexical devices that are used to mark stance and to intensify, right? So such as adverbs in English. We have direct counterparts of those, adverbs. We have direct counterparts of those adjectives, right? Actually, really, and literally. And at least in the case of really and literally, this can be used also to intensify meanings, right? Of course, once we start shifting our analysis, we have to take things like polyfunctionality into account, because at least in the case of actually, in the syntactic configurations that we've explored here, it doesn't really have a meaning of intensification anymore. It actually has a meaning of contrast, but that's a different story. And more globally, what we would like to see probably other people doing is to investigate whether these effects are stable cross-linguistically, right? Are we able to find similar processing signatures in different languages, right? But also, how do these things work if different languages have different ways of marking these things, right? Maybe not just lexically, but also grammatically. This is my very last slide. Okay, so to conclude, we showed that truth-endorsing stance marking adjectives are processed as pragmatic cues in the online interpretation of metaphors, at least in English. We show some tentative evidence, some early analysis that cue strength seems to vary across different markers, right? Across different adjectives. And one idea here might be that this may be the case because these different adjectives are at different stages of their pragmaticalization process, right? Whereas they're moving from, well, potentially just being this normal modifier to being an intensifier, right? Okay. And then lastly, also that cue strength seems to be modulated to some extent by metaphor conventionalization, right? Okay. I brought this quote here, maybe also to just inspire discussion. I presented this at some other point at a modification workshop, so I squeezed something out there, but I think it still applies very much to what we're talking about here. And that is, a full understanding of how linguistic forms function and develop would ideally require as broad an analysis as possible, right? what we've been talking about yesterday and today, take into account structural and functional perspectives, as well as considerations such as processing and social linguistic selection. And we've offered today an account based on processing and hopefully also functional perspectives. So I very much look forward to hearing more from you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. And I see Mira has a question. Let's be quick about it. Go ahead, Mira.
I'd like to take this opportunity to boldly pitch my own work with Rohde Baldenstein. It's coming out in Studies in Language. And what we did is a diachronic study of truth markers to intensification. So
I saw this paper a couple of days before the talk, but it was paywalled, so I couldn't find it. Like Sci-Hub didn't help me, but yeah.
Well, writing an email to me might be a good way.
Thank you. Yeah.
And great job.
Good. I'll just say that Alon Fishman said that he has a reading recommendation. It's Porat and Shen, paper titled Imposed Metaphoricity, and they have similar finding in Hebrew. So probably be good for you to look at.
That's great to know. Thank you very much.
Any more questions? I'll ask a quick one and then we move on to the next. Did you try to look at the statistics for only the metaphors that were really conventionalized, only the green ones? Because you showed us the variation, but not the statistics for it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I did not, but what I showed you is that that was the case for 9 out of 15 items. So I would probably assume that if we have this main effect, right, when we have the whole group taken together, this should probably be coming from, right? I mean, it's accounting for this variation already, but I should fit all of the models. Yeah. Also, probably one where I have the different adjectives where, I split things, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.